Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Luis Pessoa. I'm a faculty at the University of Maryland in College Park. This is the Neuroscience and Philosophy Salon. It's something that we get together every few weeks, sometimes a little more often, less often, to talk about what we find to be exciting issues at the intersection between neuroscience and philosophy. And we're very eager to engage with as broad a range of scholars, clinicians, people in general that are interested in these kinds of issues. And today we're really excited because we're doing actually something a little larger than our usual format. We're discussing the topic of are mental disorders brain disorders? And it's a very interesting, fascinating issue, but also there's a lot of nuance that we have to be aware of, and I'll speak to that in a second. But before that, I want to introduce the participants. And the way we are going to organize this today is we're going to have two main presentations, one by Anneli Jefferson and one by Awais Aftab, around 20 or so minutes each. And then after that, we're going to have an additional commentary by a diverse set of perspectives that will provide a diverse set of perspectives. The two first will also naturally provide multiple perspectives on the overall question, but the three commentators will provide additional points, and these are Alexey Tolchinsky, Nicole Rust, and Eiko is going to be here any minute. He's just finishing teaching. He's teaching a class as we speak. So he asked me to let everyone know that that's the reason that he's a little bit late. Okay, so let me read a tiny bit here. Let me remind myself and tell you who these wonderful participants are. Anneli Jefferson is lecturer in philosophy at Cardiff University and works in the philosophy of psychology, psychiatry, and moral philosophy. She is particularly interested in topics at the intersection of these areas. For example, the question of how mental illness affects moral responsibility. And Anneli, can you please remind us of the title of the book that you wrote? Because you didn't include it here, but we really have to mention your book, and really, it's a fantastic book that people should be aware of. Could you remind us of the title?
Okay. Yeah, it's going to come up in my talk. It's called Are Mental Disorders Brain Disorders, but I'll mention it when I give.
Okay, great. Okay,
fine.
Excellent, thanks. So Dr. Awais Aftab is a psychiatrist in Cleveland, Ohio, and clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at Case Western Reserve University. He's a senior editor for the journal Philosophy, Psychiatry, and Psychology, and he's the editor of a forthcoming book collection of interviews entitled Conversations in Critical Psychiatry that is going to be published by Oxford University Press. He has been actively involved in initiatives to educate psychiatrists, trainees, and the public in general on conceptual and critical issues related to psychiatry. Okay, so these are our two main presenters. And then what we're going to have is a commentary starting with Nicole Rust, who's a professor and brain researcher in the Department of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. She's wrapping up a book that explores the relationship between a nuts and bolts understanding of brain and mind and the ability to treat brain and mind disorders of all types, including psychiatric. Alexey Tolchinsky, it's asking if I confirm your speaking language. I'm not speaking Arabic. Let me see. I think I'm speaking some version of English. I mean, with some strange accent. English. Okay. Okay, I think I'm speaking some version of English. Okay, Alexey Tolchinsky is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Maryland here in the US, and a clinical fellow of the Neuropsychoanalysis Association. His interests include dynamical systems, chaos theory, free energy principle-based models, trauma and dissociation, cultural aspects of clinical work, and contemporary psychodynamic psychotherapy. He has authored peer-reviewed papers in these fields that highlight multidisciplinary approaches to complex clinical phenomena. And finally, Eiko is a professor, an associate professor in the clinical psychology unit at Leiden University in the Netherlands, who works at the intersection of mental health science and data science and is interested in the ontology, measurement, and modeling of mental health problems. Currently, his main focus is developing a system called WARN-D, a personalized early warning system for depression.
It looks like he's here, by the way.
Okay. So Eiko, I don't see you yet because there are a lot of things in front of me and I see you right there. Let me actually I'm making you co-host. And so Eiko, you have also access to sharing slides a little later. Once
the German being too late is terrible, but I wrote Louis that I have another lecture, so I'm a couple of minutes late. Sorry.
No, that's totally okay. I had told everyone already. So, okay, great, fantastic. So we're gonna start then. Anneli, the room is yours. Please let us know your thoughts. Oh, I apologize. Before we start, I want to say a few words because we are addressing a topic that is very delicate. There are many ways of looking at this, and we feel as a group that we wanted to say a few words. And so I'm going to read a short statement so that I get the words said correctly. And this is coming from all of us jointly. So let me read this before we start with the individual presentations. Please know that a significant drive force behind this conversation is the community of individuals who are afflicted with a psychiatric condition. To those individuals, we are empathetic. We acknowledge that there are complexities around whether and when we should consider a condition as a dysfunction, quote unquote, as opposed to a type of neurodiversity that society has wrongly become intolerant to. Cases of autism, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, and depression are all examples. That said, for each of these conditions, a subset of diagnosed individuals suffer in ways that can benefit from some type of treatment. For those individuals, when our existing treatments fall short, we need to find better ways to help. With this empathetic spirit, we will use the terms dysfunction and disorder to refer to the conditions of individuals who need better solutions than the ones we can offer today. Anneli, please, you're ready to start.
Okay, thank you. Can people hear me? Yeah, there's a thumbs up. Excellent. Thank you. So I am going to have a little slideshow. So I was recently at a talk or a meeting where people couldn't hear the speaker, and that went on for a very long time before it got noticed, and it was quite impressive. So if anything does go wrong with my sound because of the connection or similar, just put something in the chat or let me know. Okay, then thanks very much for having me. I'm gonna talk about whether psychiatric disorders or brain disorders, and given that I'm a philosopher, I'm going to give conditions as to when they might be, and not actually going to say yes they are or no they aren't, because my project is more of a conceptual one where I say, well, here's some conditions when it might make sense to call a mental illness a brain disorder, and whether these conditions are met are strongly dependent on what the empirical evidence finds. Okay, so having said that, brain disorder labels are sometimes explicitly desired by people suffering from mental distress, mental illness, but there's also a lot of people who resist them. And I'm talking about the specific link to the brain. So as we mentioned in our initial caveat, or what we want to call it, is there's also controversy about the disorder aspect of things, but what I now want to talk about primarily is the controversy concerning whether, even if you're going to call it a disorder or you're going to call it a brain disorder. And what I'm going to be interested in this talk is, first of all, why there's such disagreement about whether mental illness is brain illness or brain disease, when it would be justified to call a psychiatric illness a brain disorder or a brain disease. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to present my own account that I developed in a book, obviously just in sketch because I've only got 20 minutes. But I wrote that book 2 years ago, so I'm already now at the stage where I know some of the problems with my account. And so what I'm going to do is I'm also going to highlight some of the problems, because that will lead nicely into what Awais is doing. And I'm not doing this as a missionary event, but as one where I want to sort of think about the problems in coming to these kinds of definitions. Okay, so there's two popular positions that I want to talk about to begin with. And the first one is that, of course, mental disorders are brain disorders. And I suppose that's probably the one that I've come across first in talking to people about this. And you find it with some philosophers, but not just with philosophers, lay people, psychiatrists as well. And the thought is kind of like this. They say, well, all mental processes are or rely on or supervene on brain processes. There's a lot of complexity there that I don't want to go into. It's even possible to be some kind of dualist, but still believe this, because basically what it boils down to is no brain, no mind, shortly speaking. So, and then people conclude from that all psychiatric illness must be brain disease, because all mental activity, including dysfunctional mental activity, relies on the brain. And I did not find that a particularly satisfying solution, because the worry is, what if we don't find systematic differences between the brains of people suffering from psychiatric illnesses and the people in the non-clinical population? And I should probably give as context that I started getting interested in this topic when I was on a postdoc in the Institute for Neuroscience and Medicine in Jülich in Germany. And it just became clear to me just how much variety we find in the brain, and how hard it is sometimes to find systematic differences. So it seems like this, what could happen with this position is that it's basically not much more than a commitment to physicalism, or a commitment to the idea that, of course, mental illness has to be brain illness because mind relies on brain, but you don't learn anything informative about the brains of people who suffer from mental illness. So I wasn't happy with that one. But then there's another strand of thinking, which is quite common both in philosophy, but also especially in clinical psychology, which categorically rejects the idea that mental disorders are brain disorders. And probably this has been popularized by Thomas Sass, who also rejects the idea that there's mental disorders in the first place. But even among people who do think that there's such a thing as mental illness or psychiatric illness, there is the idea that if you were going to say that mental disorders or brain disorders, you'd have to have something in the brain that you can specify as a disorder pretty much independently, where you can see, oh, there's something that's gone wrong there. And often that relies on analogy to what I call paradigmatic cases of brain disorder. And if you've been following the Twitter conversation, it comes up very quickly. So people then think of brain trauma in the sense of brain, sort of, for example, as you have if you play too much rugby in your youth, or cancer, or cell death. And there the idea is you have something in the brain that you can call dysfunctional, and often the accompanying idea is that treatment should target the brain directly, not via some kind of psychological treatment. And the problem with that is that it's not really quite clear when you look at these claims in more detail, what can be meant by this claim that you should be able to identify brain dysfunction by looking at the brain, and that the brain should sort of give you the criterion for what's dysfunctional. Because what we see when we look at illness, generally also somatic illness, is that differences in function will be considered dysfunctional depending on their effects on what they do in the organism. So one example that I like to use is thyroid dysfunction. There's a difference in what the thyroid does and what it produces, but the reason that's called pathological is because of the effect on the organism. So my problem with this condition, there's further problems which we can or cannot go into depending on time in the Q&A. But the one that I had when I was writing the book is that it's really quite hard to pin down what exactly, other than pointing at example cases, makes something dysfunctional. So I thought, well, what can we do? And this is me trying to steer the course between Scylla and Charybdis, so between the strongly metaphysical but not very informative claim that all mental disorders are brain disorders by metaphysical fiats, and the claim that mental disorders are not brain disorders. So I was trying to find a third way, and that turned out to be slightly more difficult than one might hope. Okay, so here's a reference to my book in case people are interested. And what do I propose there? So I propose that we should think of brain dysfunction more broadly than this very narrow, we have to find something that we can independently of how it realizes mental processes characterize as, lost my sentences here, so I'm not sure where that sentence was going. Let me start again. So very often in this narrow view that I was introducing, there's the idea that you have like one cause in the brain, and then that will lead to mental dysfunction, and you can tell that something's wrong in the brain by saying, oh, it's cell death, it's trauma, it's cancer cells, and you should say, well, no, what's important is the relationship between dysfunctional mental processes and differences also in processes in the brain that you can see. So you should think of it as a form of pattern matching. And now my screen is not, there we are. So what we need is a reliable mapping between mental symptoms and brain differences. And so I came up with this definition that a difference in the brain is dysfunctional if it is sufficient for the occurrence of a mental dysfunction. So if whenever you have that brain pattern, you will also have the mental dysfunction. So that allows for different brain patterns to realize one and the same mental dysfunction. But what I wanted to try and avoid, and I'll go into a bit more detail about why I wanted to avoid that and why it's also causing problems, was the scenario where you think you found a pattern and see everybody's got that pattern of activity in the brain also shows that kind of mental pattern that we call dysfunctional. And then all of a sudden you find somebody who has the brain pattern but doesn't have the mental pattern. So that the sufficiency claim basically says, anytime you got the brain pattern, you also want to have the mental pattern. And I took that to be broadly in line with some of the projects by the NIMH and the RDoC at the time. where the idea was, yes, we think the mental disorders are brain disorders. They were a bit more optimistic than I were, but what I found appealing about that kind of approach is that they said it can also be activity patterns. We don't want to just think of it in terms of trauma and cancer. So unlike, as I said, the NIMH people at the time, I'm not saying, yes, definitely all mental disorders are brain disorders, or yes, definitely most mental disorders are brain disorders. What I'm saying is, if you can find that kind of pattern, then go for it and call those mental disorders brain disorders. Whether you find that kind of pattern matching, whether you're able to do that kind of pattern matching is then an empirical question. So that was back in 2022 in my optimistic days, and here's where we got to. What we didn't want or didn't think was realistic was a view that wants to isolate a single cause for a psychiatric illness in something that goes wrong in the brain, because that's too narrow. And one famous example for that is neurosyphilis, where you have a bacterial infection and that will lead to a bunch of symptoms, not just psychiatric ones, but also psychiatric ones. And the treatment, if you get there in time, is by fighting the bacterial infection. And that doesn't seem to be the right kind of approach to go if you want to say that mental disorders can be brain disorders, because it just isn't the way mental disorders work. You don't have one single physical cause. So I wanted to add the possibility of having patterns of dysfunctional realization, which don't have to be preceding causes. And in case that's not so clear, here's an example. So you could, for example, find systematic changes in activity of specific brain regions in anxiety conditions. But that wouldn't have to have had a preceding physical cause. It could be, for example, as a result of post-traumatic stress or something like that. And so the idea is that while I'm obviously still wanting to allow for the fact that you could have cancer or Alzheimer's causing mental symptoms, you can also, in some cases, reverse the order of justification, where you say, okay, we've got something that we're calling dysfunctional at the level of the mind. We have found a pattern in the brain that realizes it. Therefore, we're going to call that pattern dysfunctional as well. So that was the idea. And then to what extent that's borne out in reality is then a further empirical question. Okay, so that was my proposal. And I want to talk a bit more about why I introduced this sufficiency condition. So the sufficiency condition says it has to be the case if you if you want to call a certain brain pattern dysfunctional, that it will always cause the mental dysfunction. So I wanted to avoid the case where we find pattern P in lots of people with depression. Then we find a person who also has pattern P, but they don't have depression. And I said, well, I don't want to say then that pattern P counts as dysfunctional, because the link between what we find in the brain and what we find at the mental level isn't tight enough. And part of the motivation for that was I was at some talk, and this is just an anecdote to illustrate it, where a clinical psychologist was getting a bit annoyed about the whole brain disorder discussion, and said, well, I'm sure if we look long enough, we can find a correlation between schizophrenia and shoe size. So there is an ongoing worry in the literature about correlating what we find in the brain and what we find in the mind, but not knowing whether that correlation actually means anything. So this was my way of trying to avoid it. However, I have since had quite a bit of feedback on my book, and some responses written to it, which were really good and very helpful. And one response was by Awais, who's going to be talking shortly, and he picked up on something that was already worrying me. And I should say it wasn't just Awais, there was also Gerrit Fegeberg and Fabian Hundertmark made similar comments. And the worry is just that actually my sufficiency condition is too demanding. Because brain differences almost never guarantee mental dysfunction. So I'll give you a quote from Awais' paper in response to my book. And he says, "It is very difficult to demonstrate that a brain difference is always accompanied by a psychological state. We have not been able to demonstrate such a relationship even for bona fide brain disorders such as Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease." And similar points were made by other commentators. For example, you find cases where brain lesion leads to certain problems, and then you find other cases where that isn't the case, even though there's clearly been brain injury, which is sort of as paradigmatic a problem with the brain as we can find. And possible reasons for that are compensation by other brain areas, and more generally, sort of the network structure of the brain, which Louis obviously knows more about than I do, where it's just not just one area doing one thing. So the pinpointing of what exactly underlies a certain dysfunctional process is going to be extremely difficult. So that kind of brings me to the close, and I have no idea how I'm doing for time, whether I sped through or whether I'm, oh yeah, no, I'm doing pretty well.
That's good. It's good. Yeah.
So here's where we got to. I introduced the sufficiency condition, and now my worry about the sufficiency condition is that it's unrealistically demanding. But basically, it might only be met once we've completed science, and we're not anywhere near there, and we might never get there. But I'm also still worried about the alternative. So it's not like I'm just happy to give up on my sufficiency condition. And that's not just because people get attached to their theories. Because as I was trying to explain earlier on, there's also worries about weaker, more correlational claims where we say, oh, yes, well, we've seen this pattern very often in people with schizophrenia. So that shows us that schizophrenia is a brain disorder. And the worry there is that we might just not be getting at the right kind of thing. And I think there's an in-principle way forward, but I don't know how practical it is. I mean, as a philosopher, I don't have to be that practical, but I do want to be of some relevance to people who are more concerned with the applied side of things. So if what I say doesn't really make any difference to what anybody thinks, then I maybe shouldn't be talking. So it seems to me that the way forward there, and this is really where I should be writing my next paper, is looking at a modification of the sufficiency claim, which sort of tries to say, well, this is the normal role that, for example, specific process pattern of activation plays, and normally it would lead to that dysfunction, and it doesn't here because we have, for example, another compensating mechanism. Because I mean, there's some toy examples one could talk through, but I don't have time to do that. But we, on a sort of more general knowledge level, we all know that happens in the brain, and that things can go wrong in one place, but the overall system can compensate for that. And that would then allow at least to say, okay, this is a dysfunction with a normal, which normally leads to this dysfunction at the level of the mind. And when it doesn't, we have an explanation for why it doesn't, which is why we're then still allowed to call it a dysfunction, because we've shown that the correlation we've established isn't just, you know, some random thing that we've observed where we don't have any idea why and how. And that is me done for now. And now it's other people's turn. And thank you for listening.
Great. Thanks so much. That was really excellent. I think that the idea is for us to keep going, because I think we could start asking and we would have a wonderful discussion on its own. But the goal here today is to do something slightly different. So let's see how that goes. So we're going to go directly to Aves Aftab, who is going to provide his take.
Hello, good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Just gonna quickly pull up my slides. Okay, all right. Can everyone kind of hear me okay and see the slides? All right. So I'll very much be following up and building up on Anneli Jefferson's work, which I've read in detail and I greatly admire. And I want to introduce, I think, from a psychiatric perspective, as a clinician and also someone who has been involved in academic debates in philosophy of psychiatry, kind of add some more ambiguity, nuance, and also some consideration of why this question is so heated and what are the different reasons and motivations behind the disagreements that exist behind that question. So I want to hold this sort of contradictory space that mental disorders can both be and not be brain disorders at the same time, depending on how we understand that relationship. Um, the um, the main value from my perspective that I see of Anneli Jefferson's work is that she has opened up this middle ground between the narrow view and the broad view. So we have the narrow view of classic paradigmatic brain pathologies like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and in the case of psychiatry, we used to call these conditions organic psychosis. So things like, for example, where someone has psychosis, but it turns out they have an autoimmune disorder, so it's an autoimmune related psychosis, etc. So those are the classic paradigmatic examples of brain disorders we have been working at in the psychiatric and neuropsychiatric space. Versus at the other end, as Anneli mentioned, is this broad metaphysical view, which is just a commitment to physicalism or a commitment to naturalism. It basically just simply says that because the mind somehow exists because of, or because it is realized by, because it emerges from the brain, then we are kind of entitled to say that all mental disorders are brain disorders. But it's empirically empty. It is simply a philosophical statement about one's commitment to naturalism. It doesn't really specify what the nature of the relationship between mental processes and brain processes, or how exactly it is that they're realized. And what Jefferson did, sort of like in kind of breaking the impasse, is that she presented a specific kind of criterion, an empirical criterion. She said that if we can show that a brain difference is sufficient to realize a psychological dysfunction, then we can call that that dysfunction a brain dysfunction, and we can call that condition a mental disorder. As she kind of alluded at the end, I think there are a lot of problems with the idea of sufficiency. And in the paper that I wrote as commentary, I presented an alternative proposal of how we can demonstrate empirically that mental disorders can be brain disorders, and I'll talk about that. But I don't want to rigidly hold on to my own proposal as well. The main thing I want to highlight is that we have a spectrum here. We have a large middle zone in which we have flexibility in specifying the criterion, and it's sort of like, and specifying the requirements for when we can be justified in calling mental disorders as brain disorders. So I want to break down this debate into these three related questions. The first is, when are we justified in calling mental disorders and brain disorders? When do we have sufficient empirical reason to characterize them such? Then sort of like near the end of my presentation, I want to dwell on these two questions as well. What are our reasons for promoting or resisting this characterization? Why is it that some people fiercely advocate it? Why is it that some people are wary of it and resist it? And then what are we obliged to accept? We can recognize that people are coming from different perspectives, but what are the empirical facts at the end of the day that that we have to accept despite our disagreements? So I'll mention that too. And with regard to the first question, the justification question, I want to start with what neuroscience is telling us about brain behavior relationships right now. Because I think if we want to specify some sort of empirical and conceptual criterion, about when mental dysfunctions can be brain dysfunctions, it should be informed by our current understanding of neuroscience. And I want to sort of like start by our good friend Luis Pesa's work in his book, The Entangled Brain, which kind of takes the view that the brain is a complex system, and there are organizational relationships and dynamic interactions that lead to novel collective properties. And Luis kind of offers these three principles of brain organization: that there is massive combinatorial anatomical connectivity, there is the functional coordination sort of like in the brain is highly distributed, and that networks and circuits are kind of like the functional unit of brain activity. And I'm not going into detail. I'll refer you to Pessoa's book and his articles for that. But these principles, if you kind of work them out, lead to some surprising and at times counterintuitive outcomes. And for example, one of them is that we have to rethink the relationship between mental categories and brain categories. So in one of the articles, Luis Pessoa and his colleagues write, they say mental terms such as perception, cognition, action, emotion, as well as attention, memory, decision making are epistemically sterile, and the vertebrate neuroarchitecture does not respect the boundaries of standard mental terms. And a similar kind of sentiment comes from the psychologist and neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett, who said the idea that there's some kind of strong parallelism between mental categories that neuroscientists use to try and understand the brain and the neural implementation of mental events is just wrong. So we're seeing sort of like many people in the neuroscience community beginning to express that we're not going to see a neat correspondence between the psychological and mental categories that we're using, even some fairly fundamental categories such as perception, cognition. And, when it comes to more abstract and more sort of like, categories that have more social cultural influence, which includes psychiatric categories, the idea of strong parallelism just becomes untenable. Uh, Feldman Barrett's group sort of like produced this paper in early 2023, kind of revisiting some of the assumptions that underlie brain behavior relationships, and they kind of emphasize I'm just picking out two things from that article. There are many other things they discussed too, but one thing they emphasized was that there are degenerate many-to-one mappings between neural ensembles and psychological categories. So it's exceedingly unlikely that we can take a psychological category and we can find some kind of neural correlate that has a one-to-one correspondence. That's just not going to happen. And the second thing they emphasize is sort of like the complexity of how mental processes are being produced. So they say mental events emerge as complex ensembles of signals. An instance of a psychological category emerges from a complex ensemble of signals from the brain, body, and the world. These signals can only be understood in relation to the rest of the ensemble. That is, each may have a weak effect on its own, but a strong effect when considered collectively. And what this means is that any relationship is moderated by context, and if you change the context, you're gonna change the nature of the relationship. We are seeing, and this paper in particular generated some pretty fierce debate on social media and on Twitter. And in the context of in the commentary that it generated, I was really gravitated towards some comments by Kevin Mitchell, who I don't think he's in the audience today, but he often attends these as well. So I really liked what he said, and this is one of the few times I've quoted a tweet in an academic article. But he said, in my opinion, some pushback against simplistic ideas of function localization is reasonable, though I think the field has moved on from blobology, to be fair. By simplistic, I mean taking brain region A to do X based on activity patterns or lesion info, which seems to imply sufficiency, not just necessity. There's an analogous pitfall in genetics with the common construction, a gene for X, as opposed to the more careful, a gene required for X. However, that caveat doesn't invalidate the specificity of activation patterns and connectivity and lesion effect, etc., that support differential involvement of brain structures in different functions. And the fact that such functions heavily rely on interconnectivity and can be modulated by all sorts of contextual information doesn't mean it's some kind of neural free-for-all. And so what Kevin is trying to kind of express is this middle ground between sort of like pure neural chaos where sort of like there's no organization or nothing, sort of like no structure or system to be discerned, versus this sort of like traditional one-to-one correspondence idea. And there's this middle ground sort of like that we can carefully tread. So how does this sort of like, how do these neuroscientific debates inform the question of whether mental disorders are brain disorders? And I think one of the main things they do, in the context of Anneli Jefferson's work, particularly how it is in the book, is that they jeopardize the criterion of sufficiency. That is, the expectation that a dysfunctional type of brain process should always realize a psychological dysfunction. Our best understanding of brain behavior relationship tells us that this sort of sufficient one-to-one correspondence as a matter of general principle is going to be the exception rather than the rule. And in an account of brain disorders that fails to take this into account just isn't going to be very useful. If we want an account of mental disorders and brain disorders to be empirically useful, scientifically useful, then it has to work with what can be reasonably expected given our current understanding of neuroscience. So that leads to what can we reasonably expect. And I think we can expect differential involvement of brain functions in different psychiatric disorders. And this, this could be expressed in many different ways. Could be expressed with reference to brain networks and their dynamic activity, could be with reference to neurotransmitters, sort of like, different kind of brain regions, etc. But the key thing is that these associations are likely not going to be necessary. They're not going to be sufficient, and they may not even be highly specific to traditional diagnostic categories. So we can expect associations that can be systematic, they can be substantial, and they can be reliable. And they can allow for an increased neuroscientific understanding of the etiology of mental disorders and better development of therapeutics. But we have to give up that idea that there's an essence, neurological essence to any particular psychological category. There's a one-to-one correspondence and that sort of correspondence exists, regardless of the context in which that condition is taking place. And I think an example of this sort of differential involvement would be dopaminergic system in schizophrenia. This is, for example, a meta-analysis that was published in Archives of General Psychiatry in 2012, Hose et al., kind of looking at studies that were looking at presynaptic dopaminergic functioning in schizophrenia. And they find very sort of like strong and reliable pattern that there is sort of like elevated presynaptic dopaminergic functioning in schizophrenia with a large effect size. But again, this is not sensitive. I mean, sort of like not everyone with schizophrenia has it. This is not specific. People sort of like with bipolar disorder have it. People with other psychotic states have it, right? So it's neither sensitive, it's nor specific, it's not necessary, it's not sufficient, but it is systematic, it is reliable, it is meaningful. So I proposed in my paper in philosophical psychology, I kind of proposed this criterion that a psychiatric disorder can be said to be a brain disorder if there are empirically identifiable systematic brain differences associated with it. And very crucially, these associations are contextualized within a scientifically robust theoretical understanding of the brain-behavior relationship. Again, kind of keeping in mind that the old kind of reductionism and essentialism is going to be inappropriate. But as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, I don't want us to hold rigidly on to my own proposal. I think it's kind of hinting at a broader goal. And the goal is to tackle the explanatory vacuousness of the broad view. So like the broad view is metaphysical, it is empirically empty. And we want to replace it with something with meaningful scientific explanations that possess empirical value. And I don't think we need to overly constrain the shape those scientific explanations can take. I think there are many different ways in which scientific explanations can be meaningful and possess empirical value. One thing we have to keep in mind is that a wholesale explanatory reductionism of the psychological to the neurological is, unlikely, perhaps even impossible. So, that should not be the goal of the empirical efforts, but rather we can aim for what the psychiatrist Ken Kender has called patchy reduction and piecemeal integration. Again, we can find areas where we can draw, substantial, reliable, and systematic links between brain functioning and mental functioning. So that's, I think, sort of like, that's my answer to kind of like the justification part. What about sort of like our reasons as to like, why we want to promote this characterization? Why do you want to resist it? And when it comes to the reasons for promoting this, I think from a kind of neuroscientific standpoint, saying that mental disorders are brain disorders, it's an assertion that puts mental disorders firmly and legitimately within the neuroscientific domain of inquiry. It's as if the neuroscience community is saying it's okay for us to study these conditions. It's acceptable for us to study them and try to examine them. So it puts them within their sort of like epistemic fold. It's an expression of the hope that brain mechanisms involved in psychopathology will be found to be coherent and can be made tractable. So that we will in the end find some sort of systematic differences. We will find some form of meaningful explanation. Again, they don't have to be reductionistic. We're not sort of like talking about that, but we'll find some degree of coherence. And it's the slogan of a research program aimed at understanding the brain basis of psychopathology. On the other end, sort of like on the clinical side, on the social side, there are good reasons to be wary of this characterization, and the reason for that is that it conflates our really complex understanding of mental disorder psychopathology with the typical examples of brain diseases. It invites this sort of reductionism where we begin to think that there is a neurological essence to these complex psychiatric categories. So this is expressed, I think, very well by Eric Durkheimer. I'm sort of like using a quote from his 1998 paper. He says, complex human behaviors of the kind that have interested psychologists, things such as beliefs, intentions, emotions, personalities, do not have localized biological or genetic causes in the sense that stroke lesions cause aphasia or a single gene causes phenylketonuria. What troubles social scientists opposed to biological reductionism in psychology is not simply that biogenetic theories associate behavior with genotypic or neurological variation, but rather that the biological explanations are oversimplified in that they try to explain complex behaviors as if they were aphasias. So there's this danger there that if we simply rely on the slogan, it invites this oversimplistic thinking. It invites us to treat mental disorders as if they were aphasias rather than this really complex, multi-level, messy conditions that they are in reality. So there are good reasons for people to resist this characterization and for say, we don't think it's a good idea to call them this. So that kind of like leads to sort of like, I'm close to the end of my presentation, is that what are we obliged to accept? And my own kind of personal view in navigating this debate is that neuroscientists and neuroscientifically inclined psychiatrists and psychologists, they are justified in calling mental disorders as brain disorders if they want to. And again, sort of like if those empirical conditions are met, if you can show that there are substantial, systematic, reliable differences, and if you keep in mind that, that relationship is going to be complex, non-reductionist, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a heavily qualified sense, empirical sense in which you can be justified. But we, and sort of like, the multidisciplinary community devoted to the scientific study of psychopathology, we as a community have no obligation to prioritize the framing of mental disorders as brain disorders. We can accept that one can be justified in saying so based on XYZ criteria, but we do not have to accept that this is the best way to characterize mental disorders, considering their complex multi-level causality. Another thing, sort of like I'm not going to go into in detail on this, but I just wanted to briefly touch on is sort of like the disorder part of the equation too. Mental disorders are disorders because psychological features are characterized as abnormal using behavioral norms. We're kind of looking at functional impact. We're looking at things like disability. We're looking at distress, or we're looking at psychological and cognitive characteristics of the phenomena. We're looking at sort of like how rational it is, how proportional it is to the circumstances, how severe it is, etc. So there's a whole list of kind of norms that we rely on to characterize psychological and behavioral features as, as unusual or abnormal in some kind of way. And if you look at the empirical literature, folk judgments of what people call mental disorders align very highly with what they call mental health problems. So there's no, when it comes to general people in the community, their notion of mental disorder is, it tracks very well with a general notion of mental health problem. So like the term disorder is simply being used as a way of referring to a health problem, which means it's going to be really contextual, it's going to be social culturally influenced, and so all of the qualifications that come with that. So again, going back to that point that sort of like, Louise raised, is that the vertebrate neuroarchitecture does not respect the boundaries of standard mental terms. And there's no reason to expect the neuroarchitecture would respect the boundaries of the class of mental disorders. This is just not reasonable. We cannot expect that dysfunction defined with reference to psychological phenomena will correspond to dysfunction defined with reference to neurological phenomena. So one thing we do have to all agree on is that the mind is embodied. Psychiatric conditions are instantiated by, mediated by, emerge from whatever exact word you want to use, from brain and bodily processes. However, these bodily processes cannot necessarily be characterized as dysfunctional, except in the indirect sense that they mediate psychological dysfunction. We are obliged to accept that mechanisms and processes involved in psychiatric illnesses do occur in the brain, not exclusively in the brain, because there's also the rest of the body, and there's also the interaction between brain and other brains and brain and the environment. But the embodiment of mind necessitates that there will be brain mechanisms involved. However, these pathways will relate to psychiatric phenomena with varying degrees of coherence, explanatory coherence. They might be utterly incoherent, like marital status, sort of like, doesn't have any privileged status with regards to brain, but, they might be highly coherent, like aphasia. So there's this whole spectrum of coherence in which they can exist. So to summarize, there is a heavily qualified empirical sense, and not just an empty metaphysical sense, in which mental disorders can be demonstrated to be brain disorders. There are reasons for us to accept that characterization and reasons for us to resist it. These reasons differ based on disciplinary agendas. And although we are obliged to accept the embodiedness of mind and the existence of brain mechanism psychopathology, we have no obligation to accept mental disorders or brain disorders as the best or the most appropriate characterization given their complex multi-level causality. So this is my email address and the link to my newsletter if anyone is interested. And with that, I will formally end my part.
Thank you so much, Awais. That was a lot in there. We all want to jump and say something, but we'll resist the temptation and move along. Nicole is going to be now our first commentator and give some general thoughts. I think that it's going to be quite broad in the way that it's going to we're going to follow here. And please, Nicole, go right ahead.
All right. Can you see my slide, Louise?
Yes, we can see. Yeah.
Perfect. So big thanks to Louise for organizing this really important conversation, and big thanks to Anneli and Awais for so coherently describing their positions. Those talks were great. So I want to spend my precious few minutes doing something a little bit different. Instead of establishing a position and trying to defend it, what I'd like to do is just have a bigger conversation, kind of zoom out and talk about the landscape around all the positions that our community holds. And the reason I'm interested in doing this is because I think this conversation about whether psychiatric disorders or brain disorders, it's so important, and there's just so much on the line here. And as we have it, I think we need to be really as clear and open as we possibly can be, trying to understand one another. The answer to this question, I think we should all admit, epistemic humility, nobody knows what types of things psychiatric disorders are, right? Nobody knows. The answer to it is going to be complex, it's going to be nuanced, it's going to be really important. But the diversity of positions that are adopted by different people in our community, I think that they're often presented in a somewhat befuddling, overcomplicated way. And so what I want to do is I just want to kind of demystify it. It's really not so complicated. And my goal here is to lay all this out in just very clear language that anyone can understand. And the spirit here is that this is a first step toward having a really important conversation. So the summary I'm about to present to you is part of an article that will appear in the transmitter in upcoming weeks. So on this question, are psychiatric disorders brain disorders, as Anneli hinted at, right? There is this issue about whether or not, what level we should be thinking about here. So you might hear someone like Eric Turkheimer, who was mentioned by Awais, say mental illness is psychological, not biological. And you might wonder, like I did when he says that, like, what does he mean by that exactly? Especially given that we think that mental function, changes in the mind, are mediated by changes in the brain. So if you're a brain researcher like myself, it's somewhat befuddling, right? Like, why wouldn't you call these brain disorders? It just kind of makes sense. So you might wonder then, if you don't want to call them brain disorders, are we talking about some force in the universe other than the brain that gives rise to the mind? And the answer is no, Eric's not talking about that. And as far as I know, no one is explicitly suggesting this particular position, right? So everyone does agree that all of mental function is mediated by the brain. And so then the question is, well, then why the diversity of opinions, right? That's what we really need to unpack. And by my read, there are about 5 different positions that people adopt in this field. One thing that makes it kind of difficult to navigate through all of this is that their different positions are coming from different places, which I think of as falling along different dimensions. And those different positions are kind of spilling over into other dimensions. So just to elaborate on that, we've already heard about one position, right, from both Anneli and Awais. So how do we even decide whether something is a brain disorder or not? We're going to have a diversity of criteria for that. And of course, that's going to spill over into a diversity of other opinions about other issues. Another dimension that I think we don't talk enough about, and it's really important because I think this one leads to a lot of crosstalk and confusion, is what are we talking about? Are we talking about the past and the present, what we know now? Are we talking about the future? So are we talking about the effectiveness of the treatments that exist today? Or are we talking about the treatments that we hope to create in the long term? As a brain researcher, as a researcher at large, I'm very future looking, right? So I'm looking for opportunities to acquire knowledge that will be impactful in the longer term for humanity. And so I'm asking the question, should I focus on the brain? Should I focus on the mind? Should I focus something else in the long term? But if you're a clinician who's treating individuals who have these conditions, or you're an individual who has one of these conditions yourself, you're really focused on the present and how effective are the treatments that we have? And are the effective treatments, are they behavior or mind-based, like cognitive behavioral therapy, or are they brain-based, like medication or brain stimulation? So when we have these conversations, I think it's so important to be very clear about exactly what are we talking about and what point are we starting from. So those are just 2 dimensions that I see creating a lot of differences of opinions or positions in this high dimensional space. There are many others. There are ones that deal with, say, ethics, senses of agency, whether or not you think you're dealing with a complex dynamical system with emergent properties, as Awais was starting to hint at, right? All of these different positions are going to, again, spill over into these other dimensions. So that brings us to these big dimensions and the 5 big positions and what they are. I think the biggest one is the question, what is the right level to think about psychiatric disorders? Is it the brain? Is it the mind? Is it something else entirely? And so just to unpack Eric Turkheimer's position, it's really an argument about levels. Awais also hinted at this paper that he wrote. And I encourage everyone to read it. It's a really great paper. In it, he asks the reader to imagine 2 different individuals. Both are silent. One is silent as a consequence of a stroke. The other is silence because they've made a vow of silence devotionally. So in the first case, obviously, that is a brain condition, and you can track the silence back to the causes in the brain. In the second, good luck trying to track down the causes that led to the devotional silence, right? In terms of patterns of brain activity, right? It's just hard to imagine that that can be done. The argument here is that the mind, not the brain, is the right level for certain things. And among those things are psychiatric disorders. So of course, not everyone agrees with Turkheimer. There are others who think that the brain is the right level. Among them is Steve Hyman, the former director of the National Institutes of Mental Health, who's now currently at the Broad Institute. And Steve and others who adopt this position, which is more brain-centric, they don't just think that minds brains go to, give rise to minds, they also acknowledge this big feedback loop from the environment, right? So they're fully aware that environmental experiences like trauma and stress, poverty, your sense of safety, all of those things that you experience are going to feed back into your brain. It's going to influence how your brain is wired up. It's going to influence the genes that are expressed. But the argument here is that the brain is the central node through which all function passes through, and therefore it makes sense to focus there. And Steve lays that out in a great article where he says, it is the biology and plasticity of the brain itself that matter for all experience and action and all psychiatric illness. If you want to read more about Steve's position, I encourage you to read this great article in the Daedalus. So we have these two different levels, right? Should we think about brains? Should we think about minds? And then we also have, should we think about environments? So the position adopted by a community of which Tom Insel, another former director of NIMH, is now currently a member, is that the biggest influences are environmental. Again, there's stress, trauma, poverty, your sense of safety. Those have the biggest impacts on mental health. And so those are where we should focus our interventions. So the solutions are not just medical, they are social, environmental, and they are political. If you want to read more about this position, I encourage you to read Tom Insel's book, Healing, which is a recent book of his. Okay, so we have one conversation that's happening, right? Is it brains or is it other levels? And there are other levels, aren't just brains versus not brains, right? It's brains, minds, or the environment. And then there's another dimension to this that I think is really important, where I see variation, and that's this dimension. Should we be thinking about a singular level, or should we be thinking about all of them simultaneously? The biggest objection to the idea that we should not be calling things brain disorders is not that the brain is not involved. It's that the brain should not get primacy in this designation. And by calling it a brain disorder, you're implying that it does have some sort of special role. And so there are arguments that we should go back to characterizing the disorders in the way we started to think about them in the 1970s as biopsychosocial disorders, right? Which emphasizes that these are disorders that happen at all three levels. When I see individuals today take this position, I see them take it for two reasons. One is an acknowledgement of individual differences, that there is not a one-size-fits-all for interventions for psychiatric disorders. For some individuals, it's going to be a brain-based intervention, like a medication or a stimulation. For others, it's going to be a behavioral intervention, like cognitive behavioral therapy. And among the proponents of this position is Austin Cowley, who is a new faculty member at UCLA, who says personalized treatment tailored to individual needs recognizes that not all patients respond uniformly to the same interventions. It's an important point. Okay. There's a final position that moves people, I think, up on this axis, that we should be thinking about multiple levels simultaneously. And this is the idea that what we're dealing with here is a complex dynamical system where causes lead to effects, that feedback is causes. The properties of the system are emergent. You cannot understand a complex system by decomposing it into its parts. We know this from other complex systems like the weather, like ecosystems, and on and on. And therefore, we have to approach this holistically by trying to understand the system across multiple levels. One of the biggest proponents of this position is Eiko. I'm not going to try to speak for Eiko. He could speak for himself, as he will in a moment. But quotes such as, people's mental health states are outcomes emerging from complex systems of biological, psychological, and social elements. So these are the 5 predominant positions I see people hold today. I want to emphasize that in some, to me, this doesn't strike me as a conversation about whether we should call these brain disorders or not. It's not a conversation about whether Steve Hyman and that camp are right or the rest of us are, right? This is really a deeper conversation about what types of things are psychiatric disorders. And there isn't just one alternative option to brain disorders. There are many. The examples that I gave you today here, each one of these individuals I kind of plucked from as representative of a larger group. So please just consider these examples. And I don't even know if I totally got them right. It only seems fair that I have because I've stuck the neck out of these individuals, I also stick my own neck out as well, and at least tell you what my own position is. And that is, I fully agree that we're dealing with a complex dynamical system here. It is only going to be understood holistically across multiple levels simultaneously. But I will also stick my neck out and say that the only way I think we're going to get there is if we better understand the brain and how the brain gives rise to the mind. I don't think there's any way around it. So I'm just going to end there. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. I actually was wondering if you were going to present your take, and I'm really happy you did. Thank you. Okay, let's move right along. So, Alexey, please, it's your turn. I see that there you have 51 slides. I hope that that's not what you're planning to cover.
No. Three. Is
Okay,
three okay? Is
three
10 is
is
10
pretty-
minutes okay, Luis?
Okay, yes, please.
Yes?
Try,
Okay. Yes.
let's try to stay no more than, yeah, okay.
I'll stay within
Right.
10 minutes.
Please,
I
please.
I
Go ahead.
is sound okay?
Yes, everything's good.
Sincerely appreciate the invitation. I really enjoyed reading the papers and the talk and everything that has been said. I think we're pretty much all on the same page. And I think that I'll probably add one more perspective if that's okay. Bear with me, I'll be a little bit on the ground and under the hood, not very high in the abstract level. But uh, um, I think that if you look at the clinical practice, patients knock on the door, they call you. They don't do it for sports. Yes, there's jokes that in Manhattan everybody goes to the gym and everybody's got to shrink, but vast majority of people who require mental health services are struggling. They have some kind of mental pain and they want help, right? So from that standpoint, in order for us to do our work well, we need to be good at finding out what's going on, if you wish, what hurts emotionally, or understanding classification of their distress, how this feeling came about and why, what can be done to help them. So what we're talking about in the clinical work is essentially modeling. We create a model of the patient's distress. And I think the model should be judged not based on do I like the brain more or do I like the thyroid more or the gut more, but how fitting is the model to what is going on with the patient. And you know, the big trouble in the field is that we do that with statistics and convention and not with etiology. You know, I could share texts where we're trying to approach etiology with the most widely seen referral questions such as depression and anxiety, but you know, treating them with convention by saying these 9 symptoms together we consider to be a very clear-cut thing called major depressive disorder. But if you're not having one of them, it is a clear-cut thing called bipolar disorder or generalized anxiety disorder. That doesn't do anything about to answer the questions posed earlier. So if I may illustrate it briefly, some colleagues and I are working on a paper about the disgust system. We most respectfully disagree with Lisa Feldman-Barrett, who very authoritatively claims that you know basic emotions don't exist and everything is constructed. There's Jaak Panksepp's framework, there's Sylvan Tompkins and Paul Ekman's framework, and we definitely think that they do exist, and that's a different debate. But we talk about disgust, which is just only one component of the obsessive compulsive disorder. Case with contamination, obsessions, and washing compulsions, germophobia, if you wish. These are individuals who wash their hands for 45 minutes, take a shower for an hour and a half, and at the extreme case cannot leave the room. So disgust is a component of it. And if you functionally look at disgust, it is designed to protect the internal milieu of the body from pathogens, toxins, versus a fear system, which is designed to protect us from predators and external threats, right? So immune system, if you think about it, has the same function of the protection of the internal milieu, identifying what's me, what's not me, and let's get rid of the not me. Now, then it becomes very interesting if you study disgust. You will see that it's very tightly intertwined with the immune system. It becomes very interesting in pregnancy, where in the first trimester, you may see some evidence of immune system being downregulated, but disgust being upregulated. So here you have two things working in concert to accomplish the same functional goal. And oh, by the way, you know, nausea, vomiting, and retching is very related to disgust. And now you're talking about gut to brain axis. So gastrointestinal system would get involved. Endocrine systems get involved. So to some degree, whether psychiatric disorders or brain disorders is not the most useful question. I think the question to ask is how can we model what's going on with a patient most accurately? And if it includes immune system, so be it. You know, it takes a village sometimes. We don't have turf wars and saying, oh, it's not the brain, it's the mind, you know. We collaborate, you know. Some of the patients in my practice, they have psychiatrists and they have neurologists, endocrinologists, and we work together as a team, not ships in the night. So I think that's the important part. I also think that the medicalization of mental health is an issue where, you know, people are convinced that depression is a disease and not a state. If you take a medical metaphor, then, you know, flu is a disease, but fever is a state. And if you take Tylenol, it does not cure the flu, it treats the symptom. And I'm of the opinion with Mark Solms that most of psychiatry, pharmacological psychiatry, symptomatic treatment, it's Tylenol. It numbs the symptom down, but it doesn't cure anything at all whatsoever because it is not causal, it is not etiological. And I think that is important. If you look at the history, I'll put some links in the chat, but in Japan in the 1990s, the word did not exist for mild to moderate depression. GlaxoSmithKline showed up, and by that time, the worldwide sales of SSRIs were $13 billion. GlaxoSmithKline launched a powerful marketing campaign, and the two central messages were depression is a disease, depression is caused by medical imbalance. By 2008, they were selling Paxil, which is their medication, in around $1 billion of revenue. So that is a story being told to people where you get from a macro phenomenon in the brain that has contextuality, transience, emergence, all the way down to a serotonin level, to the molecular level, skipping all the levels in between. John Carroll calls it downward causation. That electron doesn't care whether it's in the hammer in the brain or on the moon. And we somehow believe this story, we buy it, and we treat patients this way. Well, no psychiatrist will be able to give you the causal chain of events from serotonin all the way to the macro phenomenon of depression. It is statistics and convention, and statistics are weak. The effect size of SSRIs for depression is 3 times lower than that of dynamic psychotherapy. I did mention in the chat the unfortunate use of the word disorder, because I think it creates bias against chaotic systems and stochastic systems that do exist in the brain. And if you evaluate evidence carefully, you will see that oftentimes, if you gravitate to aurora, you gravitate toward pathology and death. Death is a linear system. It's fully orderly. It's predictable. It's a constant. Seizure is a more orderly state than a healthy functioning. Deep sleep is much more orderly than wakefulness. The level of chaoticity increases, and we can formally measure it by checking the Kolmogorov-Sinai entropy of the scalp EEG. So I do think that word is a problem, and it excludes the dynamical system. It puts things in buckets. When a patient walks in the door, we do differential diagnosis and say, what you have is major depressive disorder. We just put them in a bucket that has no context, no transience, and no emergence. And there's an illusion of something universal worldwide. And finally, I wanted to mention that there's a big kind of schism, unfortunately, between the academic world and clinicians. And for example, if you check at the studies evaluating efficacy of psychotherapy, a lot of these studies are RCTs, randomized control trials. And in order to do one properly, you need to fix the variables, which means you conduct therapy by a manual. And it is not something that practicing clinicians do in regular world. So you're studying one thing and you're doing another. But the academic psychologists, researchers who conduct these studies, they will conclude that look at our results. This is what is effective and that is not effective. And then it's perpetuated as a gold standard. People tell you how to do your job properly, while their study had poor ecological validity. So I do think it's important to kind of connect the worlds of clinical work and academic work, and to work together and to study something that people actually do, and to realize that every combination of a clinician and patient is its own dyad, as Shedler says. It has its own emergent properties, and none of that is reflected in the randomized clinical trials. So I think I should probably wrap up and stop here. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, now for our final commentator, I should say. Eiko Fried, please.
Yeah, thanks again for being late. I hope the sound isn't too bad. They put me into a small room here. I was presenting before. It should be 7 minutes, Luis, maybe 8, but not more than that.
All good.
I'll make a more surgical comment today, focusing on one particular aspect. This is a quote from Anneli's conclusion of her summary of her book. Fantastic, highly recommended. The conclusion reads, whether we should speak of mental disorders as brain disorders will depend on how successful explanatory reduction is. And I want to talk about that today as a focus. In the beginning of the meeting, if somebody's watching this on YouTube later, please go back, because Anneli actually updated her views on sufficiency a little bit, which was really interesting. I made the slides yesterday, so this doesn't take it into account. But this also doesn't reflect Anneli's thoughts necessarily, right? This is just a relation between the speaking and thinking about something as a brain disorder and explanatory reduction. My arguments today will rely on work by people I'm big fans of, Diana Leary, Markus Ironen, and Ken Kendler. And I will argue that explanatory reduction is not a feasible framework for thinking and studying mental health problems. So what is explanatory reduction? It is the idea that lower levels, such as genes or brains, offer inherently superior explanations than higher levels, such as psychology, sociology, and so forth. So on the right side, you see my take of this. You can see this is stolen by one of Wimsatt's figures, actually, if you're a scholar in this area. And yeah, this is our take, right? Explanations are better or worse for certain things. And if this is true, the conclusion is that we can explain mental health problems at the level of the brain. We can reduce mental health problems to the level of the brain, making them what I would consider brain disorders. And now you see where the talk is going already. I have 4 points why this cannot be the case. And I would think that most of you would actually agree on these 4 arguments here. The first is a quote by Ken Kendler, many of you will know, who said that no one would seek to understand the origin of hypertension at the level of quarks. So he's sort of poking fun of the idea that explanations bottom out. If you have multiple levels of organization here on the right side, at some point, you're trying to explain a level of organization by another level of organization that is too far below. Hypertension and quarks have no relation to each other, although everything that makes hypertension is made out of quarks on some level or the other. The second argument, and somewhat related, is based on a 1972 Anderson paper, which I really love, about broken symmetry. Anderson says, even if we could reduce, for example, mind states to brain states, this does not imply our ability to start from those brain states and reconstruct the mind states. So he says, even if reduction works one direction, it doesn't mean we can then study the brain to understand the mind. There's a broken symmetry here between different levels of organization, and the best explanation for a level of organization is likely going to be at that level of organization. The best explanation for mind states is likely other mind states. Quote by Turkheimer, Nicole already mentioned the paper, I love it very much. Although carpets may have characteristic physical components, what makes something a carpet is in its relationship at a much higher level of analysis. No amount of physics would ever lead to an explanation of why some objects are carpets. I think this highlights this level of organization point extremely well. The third point, Nicole alluded to this as well, the idea of systems. Some of you heard me talk about this before. Sorry for the brief repetition, but I'm a big fan of Ken Kendler, as are some of you here too. I got to visit him in Virginia, and he gave me his bicycle, and I broke Ken Kendler's bicycle. It was, terrible emotional experience for me. Being a big fan, I felt ashamed. This is very traumatic, but I could repair the bicycle because Ken Kendler's bicycle is a simple mechanical system. It is not more than the sum of its parts, right? And that's how reduction works. Super successful. But if we've learned anything in complexity science in the last 40 years, is that reduction doesn't work for complex systems like ecosystems, lakes, the stock market, the weather, and so on. And that is because such systems have features such as emergence. And emergence, a higher order property, is best explained with higher order explanations. Lewis has written about some of these things. Markus Ironen has a philosopher from Groningen has a paper on it. I highly recommend the levels problem of psychopathology, where he exercises through a couple of these examples, like the human heartbeat or avian flight. And lastly, and this is based on work by Diana Leary, if you believe that persons are physical things, that people have properties, bodies and minds, and if you believe that mind states have corresponding brain states, and I believe most of us would believe these 3 things, you are what is called a property dualist, such as a non-reductive physicalist, for example. I don't think these ideas are outrageous, but they have consequences for our idea of reductionism. The first is that we now have ways to distinguish some brain disorders from other brain disorders. For example, here you can see that a brain tumor, this is a screenshot from Diane's fantastic YouTube lecture. You can see that a brain tumor can be a brain cause for a mind state such as anxiety, or you can see that on the other hand, a past trauma, a mind state can be related to a brain state, can be a cause for another mind state related to a brain state. Danny Borsboom writes about this as well in his paper, where they argue that the content of mental things is what drives causation, not the biological correlate, right? And yeah, we've seen some evidence for this before, so I'm not going to reiterate this point. This means, in conclusion to me, that the brain disorder framework that operates for Alzheimer's and stroke and other things is for depression and PTSD fishing in the causal dark for causal brain explanations that might be better found at the psychological level. Conclusion, I don't think reductionism is a plausible framework for understanding minds or mental health problems, and this may or may not mean, and that debate is out there, that mental health problems, this notion might block the notion that mental health problems should be considered brain disorders. Thanks for the invite. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Eiko. I have to say that overall, I don't know how the audience is, but I'm here in awe. This has been really incredible. It's so stimulating. So yeah, I ran out of words. But before we even get to questions, I couldn't track all of the debates on the chat, but I just want to, so if you have a question, you can maybe share with the group or with me, and I'll try to keep that, or please just raise your hand, the hand icon there on Zoom. But the first question that I want to invite is already, that was one that I caught before, that Manjari Narayan wanted to make a point, and I don't see you, Manjari, and in the squares in front of me, but would you like to start asking a question to the speakers, or you had a point that you wanted to make? You still, I don't know if you were, I can't see you here. I don't know if you still want to ask a question or make the point. So maybe you're not around anymore, but so, okay. So what I would like to do now is I would like to invite the audience to bring up your questions, again, in a respectful manner, and you can address the whole set of speakers, or if you have a specific speaker that you want to engage with, just maybe mention their name, and I'll try to moderate as well as possible. And please raise your hands. I'll give you a second or two to do that, because if you don't have questions, we have lots of questions, and I will invite the panelists to ask questions to each other. So given I'm not seeing any hands yet, so I think that we need a little bit of that in getting the discussion going before people feel more comfortable. So does anyone in the panel want to ask other panelists anything specific? Or Nicole, is that an applause, or was that a request for a question?
No, it was to pick up the conversation that Eiko and I were having in the chat, right? So
okay, go ahead. Yeah, please.
This question, and I really have been thinking about this a lot lately. It's the question about establishing causality between psychological variables and the degree to which we're going to be able to do that, independent of the brain, or how we're going to do that. So, just to lay out that conversation very quickly, I think we all agree with the statement: insomnia causes fatigue, right? Nobody's going to dispute that, but there isn't a physical thing in the world called insomnia that causes another physical thing in the world, fatigue. That causal relationship happens via the brain. I think we all agree with that as well, right? A lack of sleep leads to the brain state, which leads to the mental state of fatigue. And so I think it's an interesting question. How are we going to establish causality between these psychological variables, and when is that useful? Now, obviously, if somebody has fatigue, right, you want to help them get some sleep. You don't need them to think through like what's going on with your ion channels, what's going on with your brain activity patterns, right? It's just not a useful level of the brain to think about that. But to me, it's not so obvious that when things get really complicated and we have lots of psychological variables interacting in the ways that they do in psychiatric disorders, it strikes me that the only way we're going to solve this is by digging into the brain and starting to use the brain and the physical interactions to tease those things apart. But I would love to hear Eiko's statement on that, because he mentioned this in his talk, which then elicited my comment in the chat.
I'd be happy for other folks to chime in on this.
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Moi?
Yes, we want to hear you. Yes.
Well, so I think this goes back. So my central thought on this is what I've been thinking about most, Nicole, is the relation between mind states and brain states, right? And some philosophers I like have not touched this subject very much, and they talk about correlation, for example, right? And then Anneli talked about supervenience, for example, in the beginning in one of her slides. I think I saw the term. And I think that's the central question here. What is the nature of the relationship between mind states and brain states? I think we all agree that we have brain states, and I think most of us would agree that we have mind states, and then we all probably agree, if we believe in those two things, that they have some relation to each other. But what is that relationship? And I think that is central to the question that you raised, Nicole, to answer that question. And I don't have a super strong view on the exact relationship. I just believe that it's not going to be a simple cause and effect relationship. Multiple realizability throws a wrench into this, right? At a pretty fundamental level, I think, in terms of causal inference. And so does supervenience. If mind states supervene on brain states, it's going to be very hard to go back to brain states from mind states using even fancy neuroimaging. So these are my concerns about this framework working. And I see all the hands are raised, which is awesome. So some debate.
Yeah, before I take on the next question, I just want to point out that I think, Eiko, what is really interesting here is that you're explicitly putting that arrow in the mental domain. And sort of for a neuroscientist like myself, like Nicole, the bypassing of the brain leads to, and I'm speaking for myself here, it leads to that first reaction, but that I might have had that reaction maybe 2, 3, I don't know, 5 years ago. But the more I've been engaging with these kinds of ideas and this kind of thinking, it really strikes me as in fact, perhaps the more productive level to go. And so I would just tiny bit amend Nicole's suggestion, would be my suggestion. I think it's provisional. I'm just trying to learn these things. But when we can go via the brain, for whatever reason, because we turn just to find something by chance, like so many things are in medicine are just by almost randomly, that by chance they find that some medication is really good for X or Y, and it was never designed that way. But in any case, whenever it goes via the brain, for whatever reason that we happen to find it, then we can embrace that and pursue that. But I do think that in many circumstances, it is the case that this level here, mind, and social, cultural, and etc., it really might be the level that will carry the bulk of the weight, explanatory and in ways that I think us neuroscientists are really hesitant to see. But I think it's something that being encouraged to consider that possibility is a really important step, I think, because otherwise neuroscience is always going to try to force this reductive and this pathway into brain mechanisms as the critical one. And as everyone has given so many examples, we're not going to explain the success of Brazil's soccer team in the last World Cup, or lack of success, based on some super low level, something that is at the incredibly low level brain level. It has something about the dynamics of the team not coalescing or what have you, and that is the proper level. So I think that we need to really understand not only that the brain level can it can be extremely difficult to pinpoint, like Awais was outlining, but in some cases it could be a distraction. I mean, that's my position, and I'm happy that to have Nicole as saying that we have to go through the brain, because I want to think why or why not. But anyway, I shouldn't be speaking too much. That was not my goal here. I apologize. I'm gonna go straight to Stephanie.
Point.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Piggyback off your point. Because you sort of
Sure.
mentioned
Who are you?
Azure.
Hajar, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Hands up. I'm sorry that I think Stephanie, your hand was up before me, but I thought I would just piggyback because Lewis, you sort of touched on one of the main things that I wanted to say. So firstly, I loved all the talks. This was like the best salon that I've been to. So I absolutely love the talk. I've been reading a lot of the works for a long time. So I've really influenced by everyone here. One of the things I've noticed for the last couple of years, so I do brain behavior relationship research. And since I started, I've been questioning my own research, basically my entire PhD. And the more I do it, the more I question it. And I think it's similar to what you were saying, Lewis, where I think in a way, us neuroscientists really want to be like relevant. Like we want to center the idea that the brain has to be part of the system when it comes to understanding mental health disorders. So when we ask questions like, are mental disorders brain disorders? Like there could be a much better question, which is like, if mental disorders are not brain disorders, what could they be? So could they be social disorders? Could they be, could it be that people don't have the right tools that they need in a society to function very well? And that is really what's causing mental disorders. And in that case, the practical solution doesn't really matter whether their amygdala is enlarged or overactivated. What matters is you change things in the society or the politics within a framework or a region so that people actually improve their mental state. Because one of the things I have noticed is as much as people try to push away from reductionism in science, which I appreciate, it's still what's interweaved is a sort of like Western individualism in mental health research, where it's like we still focus a lot on the individual, which makes it really difficult to take the brain out of the equation and think about anything else. And I keep finding that to be like it stops us from being able to propose more radical ideas as to what can cause or help mental disorders that completely, it doesn't make the brain as relevant as it is now, which of course we want it to be as relevant as it is now. And one of the things I noticed studying other cultures is there are cultures that do not care about anything in the brain, and they seem to have much less mental health disorders. So, the overemphasis of the brain doesn't necessarily translate to decreased mental health disorders or like better treatment. So yeah, I feel like as much as I really appreciate the scientific and the philosophical side, there seems to be such a missing social, political side that I think is much more explanatory than anything that we can find in the brain.
Thank you, Hajar. Really great comment. Really, thank you. Stephanie, it's your turn.
Thank you. And I want to echo Hajar's comment that this was an absolutely fantastic salon. I knew before it would start that it would be fantastic. I told everyone that I could think of about it. My lab was here, and now I have my PhD student here, still hanging out with me over here. But yeah, we just had an absolute blast, and yeah, I just want to thank you guys all for being here. But getting into it a little bit more, so Eiko was talking about, some fancy neuroimaging, which is some stuff that I like to do, at least the neuroimaging part. But I do always think about this distinction between, this epistemic view of whether we can reduce things from mind to brain, and then sort of a pragmatic view, even if, let's say that we could actually do some form of reductionism in that way, which I personally have my own thoughts about. Pragmatically, given the limitations of our measurement tools and methods that we use, would we actually put would we go forward and think that we should pursue some of these paths, or at least right now, how much should we be putting our stock into some of these methods? But yeah, I'm just curious to hear, it seems to me that a lot of the talks today were a little bit more on this pragmatic side. Can we think usefully about reducing things to the brain? And I'm just curious to hear from some of the speakers about where they are kind of in this, when they're offering some of their opinions, whether they're thinking more about the epistemological sense, like maybe in theory we could reduce these things compared to the pragmatic sense. We should really be focusing more on what we can do pragmatically. Seems pragmatically, but I'd like to be corrected.
Does anyone have, yeah, Anneli?
Yeah, as a philosopher, I'm very, very surprised at being accused of being pragmatic. Doesn't normally happen. So I would say, to an extent, like I felt like in some ways what I'm trying to do is not as pragmatic as I would like it to be, because it's very much about trying to do pattern matching as a way of justifying that there's also something going wrong at the level of the brain. So something I didn't talk about in the talk is that when I was first starting to work on this, it was very much coming from the computer analogies and hardware-software distinction, and when can we inherit dysfunctionality down from different levels of description. And I feel like that's, the hope is maybe a bit useful, but I've been quite impressed by some of the other talks which say, well, your sufficiency is too demanding. We want something more useful than what you've got. So I would say probably I was on the least pragmatic in this particular set of people. And one other thing I want to say, but I'm going to say that very briefly because it could blow up, is it's really tricky with reduction, because there's I in the book I distinguish 4 different notions of reduction, and then Lewis in his book has another one. And certainly when I talk about reduction, I don't mean that it's the better level, the lower level. It's purely about, can we match up the levels rather than is one the preferable level. Okay, I'm going to shut up now.
Does anyone want to say something? Yeah, Awais.
Yeah, I think a couple of points I want to bring up. One, I think as Nicole mentioned at the beginning of her talk as well, right now we are operating in a state of scientific ignorance, because like no one has a central mechanistic account of psychopathology, like and until we get that scientific puzzle solved, we don't know. And I think what we want to accomplish is that not prematurely close off certain options. So we can't sort of like simply assume that yes, the answer will be some form of neurobiological dysfunction, or there'll be like, the answer would take this or that form. Like what we want to do is that consider the full range of possibilities and then explore that full range. And it's an empirical open question regarding which condition would turn out to have what sort of mechanism. So it is possible that a psychological phenomena is best explained by another mental phenomena, but it's also possible that a psychological phenomena is best explained by some kind of weird complex combination of phenomena that exists at biological and psychological and possibly even kind of interpersonal social level. So we have to be open about possibility. So there's this danger that some people, I think, can lean into using avoiding explanatory reductionism, but then kind of almost acting as if the brain is irrelevant, or sort of like, or the brain will never be found, we will never find coherent or systematic mechanism. And I think that's a dangerous assumption too. The second thing is that I think there's a danger when we start talking about causality, because causality itself is a really complicated philosophical notion, and there's like strong disagreement among philosophers as to whether it is even one single notion or it breaks off into many different kinds. And I think the traditional intuitive notion of causality is that old kind of billiard ball causality, where you have sort of like one thing striking or physically acting on another, sort of like this sort of like substance-based metaphysics. Versus if we are talking of patterns and processes, and we're talking about relationships between patterns and processes in a complex system, that requires very different form of causal explanation than that old kind of Newtonian kind of model. So I think that's another danger I think we have to avoid. Then when we start talking about causes, we have to realize that causality itself is not one single thing, but rather different forms of organization invite different forms of relationships and different forms of interaction. This also gets a little complicated because in medicine, we tend to distinguish between pathophysiology of a condition and etiology of a condition. So for example, if you take lung cancer, I mean, smoking causes lung cancer. It's a huge risk factor for lung cancer, but that is not the pathophysiology. The pathophysiology is itself sort of like the aberrant sort of a reproduction of the cell, sort of like the genetic mutation in the cell, right? So there are mechanisms that are instantiating something, and then there's everything kind of around it that leads to that state. And it gets more tricky in complex systems like the brain, but there's we can think of all sorts of kind of social risk factors or psychological risk factors, but they're still being instantiation sort of like somehow sort of like there's still kind of like physiology involved in some way. And again, the question is what sort of coherence would it have? So distinguishing between that sort of risk factor versus mechanisms can also help us avoid some of the confusion we see in discussions around causality.
Thank you, Awais. That's great. Alexey, if you have a quick comment, go ahead, because I also want to let Jesus speak up because it's getting a little bit late up in the hour. But yeah, go ahead if you have a brief comment.
I'll be very quick on Nicole's scenario with insomnia and fatigue. I mean, what we do usually, we hear insomnia, fatigue, and depression and anxiety is postpone the inference on what causes what and collect more information. So sleep onset insomnia, sleep maintenance insomnia, patient suffers from each one of those. And if we can do something about them, say they're snoring, and we diagnose that there's apnea, we take care of that, as opposed to spending a long time to figure out what causes what. That is a problem in our clinical thinking called narrative fallacy, but we try to alleviate as many symptoms as possible. That's it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Jesus, welcome. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot. You can hear me well, right? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear well.
First of all, I appreciate all the comments. They have been wonderful. And myself, I would like to perhaps represent a slightly different position from those that have been already represented. And it's the position of a clinical neuropsychiatrist that every day has to make the question, is this person with a mental disorder, does he or she have an actual brain disease? And is this disease related causally to the psychopathological pattern? So that's the everyday experience. So that's why I would like to represent a position in which myself, I would reject the position in which we already know all the empirical facts. I don't think we know all the empirical facts to make a perfect discrimination between the mental disorders and the neurological diseases, because the boundaries are always changing. So that forces us to remain with some flexibility in our thoughts. So I don't think we have to choose between a position that regards all mental disorders as brain disorders or brain diseases, but I don't think we also have to accept a position in which none of the mental disorders are actually brain diseases. I would like to represent a clinical position in which we need to acknowledge the heterogeneity of the clinical scenario, because as I said previously, every day, myself, I have to ask the question, is this person with a mental disorder having an underlying brain disease? And is there a causal relationship in case it has a brain disease? And if there is a causal relationship, are there other biological, psychological, or sociocultural factors in play? Because I think we can reject reductionism even if we acknowledge the need for more empirical work in the field of neuropathology, clinical neurology, neuroscience. We can still reject reductionism because, for instance, a patient with vascular dementia or epilepsy can also have important psychosocial factors contributing to the causality of the psychopathological pattern or to the outcomes. So the multicausality picture is for all medical problems, not only for psychiatric problems. So finally, I would like to say that in the last years, as opposed to the standard narrative that I've heard many times, there have been many discoveries that change the actual scenario for specific cases. That is something that I would like to insist, that the change is perhaps at the level of specific cases. I think that psychiatric categories like schizophrenia, bipolar, OCD, and so on are pragmatic categories that, of course, have important problems of validity, like Eiko Fried has shown the extensive problems of validity of the depression construct. So we will always have problems in the validity of those categories, but for specific cases, there may be important changes coming from the empirical sciences, and I would like to represent that position. For instance, if I say, is depression a brain disease? Perhaps the general position would be, there is not enough empirical evidence. But if we are talking about a 60-year-old man with hypertension, diabetes, and depression, you might be interested in making an MRI in that case. And if you find that there is extensive white matter disease in that person, you might ask if there is a causal relationship between the brain disease and the psychopathological pattern. So just to finish, I would also reject a position according to which if the patient has a neuropathological pattern that is significantly related to the psychopathological pattern, then we disregard it as not being a mental disorder. Because if we hold that position, the discussion is already solved. There's nothing to discuss. If you find out the neurobiological factor with an important contributing to the causation process, if you find that and you will automatically say that that is not a mental disorder, then there is nothing to discuss. I think that what we need to acknowledge is that empirically what we do is to identify psychopathological patterns with the definitions that Awais, Aftab already told us. I think those are good criteria. So we recognize a psychopathological pattern, and then we see if it has a relationship with a neuropathological pattern, which is already the case in many problems. So my position would be that some mental disorders are brain diseases. That's all.
Thank you, Jesus. That was great. That was excellent complementary view to what has been discussed before. Thank you. Are there any, I know it's advanced in time here and everyone is extremely busy. Are there any final positions, burning questions that anyone wants to pose? We're happy to continue the debate in other forms in the coming weeks and months, but I think that this is a good point for us to stop then if there are no, there is, Anneli.
Yeah, thank you for organizing us. That was great.
Oh, no, of course. Yeah. Oh, no, thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so if we want to continue, there's so much of that can be said and then that needs to be said and discussed that I just as always, suggestions are very welcome for us to decide what the next salon we should feature. So by all means, but in the meantime, I'll just wrap this one up and I will be uploading it to the channel a little later today. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Good night. Bye.